Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Disability Rights Center Presents. I'm your host, Cindy Robertson, and I'm a senior staff attorney with the Disability Rights Center. Today's show is going to be about Lakeview Neurorehabilitation Center in Effingham, New Hampshire. We're going to do this as a two-part series, and our guests today are Dick Cohen, who's the Executive Director of the Disability Rights Center, and Karen Rosenberg, who is a Senior Staff Attorney with the Disability Rights Center. So I welcome both to the show.
Thank you.
You know, one thing we wanted to do a two-part series about Lakeview because of all the controversy and the publications that have come out recently about the issues and atrocities that are happening at Lakeview. And we know that both of you have worked on an investigation into some of these atrocities, and we wanted to bring it out to our viewers what's going on. So let's start. Our viewers may not actually be familiar with what Lakeview is. So can we start with what Lakeview is? Karen, you want to start?
Well, Lakeview is advertises itself as a residential rehabilitation facility in New Hampshire. It has a license to serve 88 individuals, children and adults, who have neurobehavioral challenges and typically brain injuries or other developmental disabilities and behavioral challenges. And that's what they hold themselves out to providing. They have a school that's been approved by the Department of Education to provide a special education program for the students there. And that's what they're supposed to do. The problem that we've seen is that they have not been really providing the services that they hold themselves out to provide, and instead they are really creating an environment in which people with very significant disabilities and who are vulnerable are placed in situations where they may experience abuse or neglect or just really substandard treatment.
Now we're gonna save really the meat of the investigation for the second part, but I do want to talk a little bit about how long has Lakeview been around? I mean, how long have people going there, just generally?
Well, more than 20 years. I don't know the exact date that they started. They had been under prior ownership up until at least the past 10 years.
And when did the Disability Rights Center start to get some complaints or start to bring to their attention that there's things going on there that weren't appropriate, generally?
Yeah, I think over the years, even before it was Lakeview, when it was called High Watch and under a different ownership, we had occasionally gotten some information about and some complaints about High Watch and then Lakeview. Again, most of the residents there were sort of unable to call us, didn't even have the ability, but we would address those. And then beginning, especially about 3 or 4 years ago, we started getting more and more complaints and began about 2 to 3 years ago our first sort of major investigation that Karen oversaw. So there's been some history of it, and that it seems to have escalated over the past 3 to 4 years, maybe because we have even more presence there and people realize that there's a place to call where they could get where there may be some hope.
Right. Now for our viewers, let's go back a little bit on history. Lakeview was initially created to serve what population?
I believe people with brain injuries.
Okay. But currently there's people there over and beyond just people with brain injuries.
Sure, there's people who have developmental disabilities, people with sort of a combination of maybe a brain injury, developmental disability, and also psychological issues and particularly behavioral challenges. Right.
And Lakeview is definitely an institution as we define it in New Hampshire. Dick, I know you did a lot of work with the Laconia State School, which was an institution as well, and you were instrumental in having it closed down. Can you give the audience some history there about sort of you go from Laconia working really hard to get it shut down, we end up in 2015, we still have an institution called Lakeview. Give us sort of how that came about.
Well, that's a really good point. There's a connection there. The reason why we sort of targeted Laconia State School, this is years ago, back in the late 70s, was because it was a very isolated, segregated institution. Although it was in Laconia, it was sort of outside Laconia, and there were, at one point, 1,000 residents there. But when we filed a lawsuit against the state school and the state for maintaining such a facility, there were about 600 individuals there. Again, almost their entire life was at the state school. And the reason why the state school became necessary when it was first built, and the reason why it continued, was because of a lack of community-based services. And through the 60s and 70s, a number of practices were developed which demonstrated that people, even with the most significant disabilities and even behavioral challenges, the type of people that are at Lakeview, can be served in the community. In other words, there's nothing magical about bricks and mortar. It's really having quality direct support staff, quality clinical staff where that's necessary, programmatic staff. So with the fact that there was now evidence that all people, even with the people with the most severe disabilities, could be served in good community settings, and I emphasize good, we filed suit against the state saying not only is Laconia horrid, but you don't even need it, because with a good community-based system, you don't need a place like Laconia, and frankly, you don't even need a place like Lakeview. Lakeview's a lot smaller. There's, as Karen said, about 80-plus individuals, but it's still very segregated, kind of a total institution. And we can talk about this more, but basically the reason why a place like Lakeview became necessary, at least in my view, is because although as a result of the Laconia State School suit, a good community-based system was developed, even for people with significant behavioral issues, that system started eroding. Once the lawsuit kind of withdrew, and due to budget cuts and other factors, that system started eroding, and as a result, different private vendors came in, taking advantage of the situation, and created a place like Lakeview because the community system, wasn't strong enough anymore to serve folks with significant challenges.
Karen,
I was going to say, I think it's really important to think about what it means for a person to live in an institution, and what an institution is. I mean, it's a place where you're not an individual. You're grouped with people who have similar disabilities, or only people with disabilities. Your only opportunities for interactions and forming relationships, for the most part, are with people with disabilities, and you don't have very many opportunities to do things in the community that people can do. So forming different relationships, obtaining gainful employment, going shopping, eating at restaurants, going to movies, doing things that people just take for granted in their day-to-day lives. And what we're doing when we put someone in an institution is we're segregating them, and we're isolating them, and not giving them the opportunity to live the way people want to live.
Right. And when someone is at Lakeview, what opportunities do they have? I mean, if the kids, I assume, are getting some type of education.
Well, barely. I mean, our Department of Education has recently found that there's no curriculum there, and the kids are only getting minimal opportunities for education. But they are, if they're living there, and most of the students there do live there, their lives are mostly on the top of this small mountain, on this campus that's contained, where they don't have a lot of opportunities to enjoy what the general community enjoys. And, at a certain point, we're supposed to be educating children and helping them to grow up and to transition into adulthood, to live in communities where adults live and work and have families and are active in their participants in their community. And being really segregated like that, you're not getting opportunities to develop those skills or enjoy those kinds of activities.
And you raise a good point. The location itself is isolating. I mean, for those of the audience who know where Effingham, New Hampshire is, it is rural. It's very, very rural. And I know that we can look on Google Earth for those of us who can do that, and you can just see the surrounding trees and forests and mountains. And it's not like you're downtown Manchester and go to the movies.
Right. Yeah. I mean, even if you were really free to come and go, there's really nowhere to go.
Right.
At least not within walking distance.
Unfortunately, the most tragic example of this dichotomy between living in the community and going to a place like Lakeview can be seen through one of the investigations that Karen did. Was a young man who ended up at Lakeview, but was living in a community, was having a really great life, participating in all sorts of community activities, both independently and with supports, and had a kind of a life event in his life where he lost the provider and got depressed, ended up at New Hampshire Hospital, and then he was, for a brief period of time, and then it was transferred to Lakeview. He lasted at Lakeview for 2 to 3 months because he started starving himself. He would refuse to eat because he was depressed, because he was no longer, in the community living his normal life. He was in this place, and we'll talk about it more in the next show. But as a result of starving and some other factors, that ultimately contributed to his death. Yeah. The contrast between the life he had and the life at Lakeview, and then the causes of his death really show why we both need and can have a community placement, community services.
So, let's get into a little bit about the investigation. Can you give us just sort of generally the types of complaints that the DRC was starting to hear or get wind of or get calls about?
Well, shortly after I started at DRC, maybe even not that shortly, we received a complaint from a Lakeview resident who alleged that she was injured due to excessive force and restraint. She alleged that a staff member had actually hauled off and punched her in the eye during a restraint. And we conducted a really thorough investigation into her allegations. And through that investigation, we learned of other incidences of abuse at Lakeview, including a young woman who had been left unsupervised and was sexually assaulted by another resident, someone who had been sort of jumped by a staff member and suffered abrasions and bruises on his body. We determined that Lakeview's staffing patterns didn't really meet what the needs were of the clients there, and that Lakeview was relying on staff who were assigned to provide really direct one-on-one supervision to a particular resident to also supervise other individuals, which meant that no one was getting the levels of supervision that they needed. Right. And we published our first report about Lakeview summarizing those incidences in 2011. We also brought those concerns to the attention of the state's Department of Health and Human Services Licensing Division, and nothing much happened. They found that Lakeview was licensed and didn't feel that the concerns we raised really rose to the level of violating New Hampshire's rules for such facilities. Right. But that's the beginning, and then...
Let me just jump in for a minute. So give the audience a little bit of background on the Disability Rights Center. I mean, how do you go in and do an investigation of a place like Lakeview when you get a phone call and said, whatever, my daughter or my wife has been raped or has been assaulted? Maybe you get the name, maybe you don't get the name of the person. Give the audience a little bit of background about the Disability Rights Center's authority on that.
Well, the first thing you need to know is that the Disability Rights Center is the protection and advocacy agency for the state of New Hampshire. We're federally designated such. And as the state's protection and advocacy system, we are authorized and actually we must investigate instances of abuse and neglect of people with disabilities and provide other kinds of advocacy services to ensure that people with disabilities are afforded their civil rights. Mm-hmm. Is that
right? Yeah, and when we feel that we have probable cause to believe that there's abuse and neglect of someone with a disability, that gives us not only the responsibility but the authority to go to the facility, to interview folks, to access records with after we follow certain procedures, and basically do an investigation that is very similar to what the police can do or what the Attorney General can do.
And look at all the
and
records,
so forth. Right.
Interview people.
Exactly, right. Yeah, and observe, right.
So do people have to give you their names of people there, or can they just say, hey, I heard about, or generally how do these come? Because sometimes you don't really want to give a name, you don't want to give your own name.
Right.
Does it matter?
No, we can do either, as long as we believe that there's some credible evidence, whether we get specific names or get a description of conditions. And if we go there and we find that there is not a problem, then sort of no harm, no foul. But the purpose of the federal law, which gives us this authority, is we're all responsible, licensed attorneys, and basically, the sort of rule on abuse and neglect reporting and investigations and screening is to err on the side of caution. If you feel that there's a likelihood or a possibility that there's abuse and neglect, you should go and check it out in some fashion. And then, of course, if you find out that there is no problem, then as I say, there's no harm. I mean, these are all licensed. We go into licensed facilities. They're getting federal, they're getting state funding, and they should be held accountable. And this is one additional protection that Congress decided was necessary to invest in one agency in every state, a protection and advocacy state, which is completely independent from the state, the ability to go in when they feel that there's abuse and neglect.
I mean, obviously, the more information that we receive, the better our investigation can be.
Right.
But we understand that sometimes people may not want to be like the person who gives us the complaint may not want their name to be public. We can keep that confidential.
Right.
But it certainly helps if someone is concerned about a person in an institution to know who the name of the person who is allegedly being abused or neglected. Obviously, that's going to help us, because if we just get sort of a general complaint, it's going to be a lot more difficult to necessarily see what the person complaining is talking about.
So, Karen, when you back in 2011, when you first started to get these complaints and do the investigation, I'm just curious, what is Lakeview's or any other institution's response when you knock on their door or you show up in their doorstep and said, we've got probable cause and we want to come in and we've got these complaints? So what is their reaction? What was their reaction when you first started working on this?
When we first started, they had a quality assurance staff member, and she was actually very helpful. She helped us to schedule interviews with all of their employees who were, not just all the employees who were relevant to our investigation. They allowed us to tour the facility. They gave us a meeting place to have confidential meetings with not just the person who was the alleged victim, but also people who may have been witnesses. So they were very cooperative initially and during that investigation. In the second investigation that we did, that I was involved with, the death investigation, ultimately they were cooperative. Initially, the road was a little bit bumpy. I think that had to do with the fact that there was a new quality assurance person in place, and that person was lacked experience. They were a little bit more reticent, but ultimately we were able to interview the necessary staff members. We were able to meet with the clients who had some experience and perhaps would be able to contribute to our investigation.
Okay. And so when you get these complaints, and when you first did your first investigation in 2011, was there any other public authorities involved? Is the Health and Human Services involved, or is it just strictly a call to the DRC and the DRC is doing this? Or was there police involved?
Well, in that first investigation, I believe that the person who was the victim called the police on her own, and not a lot came out of it. After we completed our investigation, we issued it to members of the legislature. We issued it to the Department of Health and Human Services. We followed up with both Lakeview and with the Licensing Bureau. We sent it to the Joint Commission, formerly known as JACO, which certifies approves or credits facilities. We sent it to CARF, which is sort of the Joint Commission equivalent for rehabilitation facilities.
And this was back in 2011.
This was back in 2011 when we issued the report.
And what was the response?
Well, the doors were pretty much closed on us.
Well,
people didn't seem that concerned.
Let's get a little bit of details about the 2011 report. You talked about the incidents, but so how long is the report, and when you give the publish to all these agencies, do they read it? Do they call you up? Do you talk to the press? What happens when they suddenly get this information on their desk? Had they been aware of it? What happens?
Well, like I said, back in 2011, it was frustrating from my perspective because there really weren't media calls. There really wasn't a huge outcry. Now, what we found in that investigation was that we could not substantiate the allegation that a staff member had actually hauled off and punched this resident in the eye. What we found was that the use of restraint in this case was not warranted, that the staff had acted inappropriately and escalated a situation that could have been managed in a way that wouldn't have necessitated a restraint of any kind. So we thought it was serious, and I think it is serious, that staff weren't complying with this woman's treatment plan, that in this case, it all basically boiled down to she had a medication that was something that was a PRN, something that she could take as needed. She asked for her PRN, and the staff just refused to do anything to get her PRNs, and she was very uncomfortable. And she was upset and decided to get her medication on her own and left her cabin to go to nursing to get her medication. If staff had just followed the protocol at the facility and made the call and gotten her medicine, could have nipped the problem in the bud.
Right.
So that's what we found.
And this sort of goes back to, if she was living in the community, or if that happened to you or I at their house, we could have just gone and gotten our own medications as needed, or asked somebody to help us. It certainly would not have led to allegedly somebody punching me in the eye because I wasn't getting my medication. It's you raise a good point about what happens in an institution and the institution mindset versus sort of the community mindset. It's more open, it's more flexible, it's more. So were there recommendations made at the end of your 2011 report?
Yes, we made a number of recommendations, including a lot of recommendations about communication and complying with behavior plans that the clients have there, not relying on staff to provide both one-on-one coverage as well as coverage for other people. We made recommendations about their protocols. There were a number of recommendations, all centered around making sure that there's, clear development of behavior plans and that staff were appropriately trained, that there were staff in place, and that people complied with people's treatment plans, essentially.
So before we get to that, does a place like Lakeview, does it actually have internal policies and procedures regarding the use of restraints or seclusions?
Yes.
Yeah, and so when you did your investigation in 2011, did it look like they were following the internal protocols, or maybe the protocols themselves were not appropriate?
Well, I think it was a combination, actually, but in large part, they weren't even following their own protocols.
Okay.
And they did not have very good communication between and among the administrators, the clinical providers, and what the direct care staff, who are not very educated people, but they're the people sort of on the front lines who are managing and people in their cabins, on the grounds on a day-to-day basis. And because of that lack of supervision, there was a lack of consensus about how this particular resident should be treated. People just kind of did whatever they felt they wanted to do. And
in the moment.
And you can't, you're not providing effective treatment when you have, someone with multiple needs where everyone isn't on the same page about what this person's treatment plan is and how to effectuate that plan.
Right.
And so in her instance, some people found her kind of difficult and decided, well, they're going to do X instead of Y. And so although when someone asks for their PRN medications, they ought to get them, there ought to be a call to health services, a staff member just basically made up a policy that didn't exist. Right. And he told her, no, you can't have your medication unless you're in bed, which she was smart enough to know wasn't the case.
Right.
And that just got her upset. Yeah. She wasn't being treated with any kind of respect at all.
Yeah. Right. And as Dick has pointed out earlier, it's really difficult for people there at Lakeview to even call our office, to call anybody to say, this is not right, what's going on.
Right. Yeah, I mean, imagine just any one of us or someone else without any training, and you're trying to provide support for someone with very challenging and complex behaviors. And, a lot of it is just treating someone with dignity and with some humanity. I mean, not all. And, but, the folks at Lakeview who are hired, the direct support staff, don't have any training. I mean, they're high school grads or GED grads. Some may have college, but they have no training. They're getting mixed messages, and there's, as Karen pointed out, as we found in several investigations, little communication across disciplines, and then from the clinical and administrative staff down to direct support staff. So they're kind of left on their own to figure out what to do. Right. Frankly, the labor pool that they're drawing from, it's an isolated area, is not vast, so they, oftentimes are forced to take whoever's available. Don't train them properly.
Pay's not probably that great.
No, to say the very least.
Right.
And so as a result, you have this sort of perfect storm of people undertrained, understaffing, with folks with very challenging behaviors. And,
right.
And you don't have the normal community monitoring. I mean, this place is very isolated, so that kind of natural monitoring that may go on in the community can't go on at a place like this.
Right, right. So we're getting close to the end of this show because we wanted to give our audience the background on it. In our next show, we're going to dig further into the second investigation that was more recent, that is beginning the publicity. I do want to ask you next show what their response was to your recommendations in 2011, see how that ties into what actually happened later. But we do want to let the audience know that if you have concerns or someone you know is having issues at Lakeview, absolutely call our office, Disability Rights Center in Concord, New Hampshire. We're going to put up our address and phone number. You can check our website. We've got a lot of information about the Lakeview investigation on our website, and you can certainly call us at any time. So I want to thank you both, and we will be back, and we will do the rest of the story, as they say.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.